All right, everybody, welcome into the inaugural Stadium Seats Sports podcast. My name is Coop, here with my partner and co-host Kriv. Today, we're going to be going over and reacting to the AP Top 5 teams, letting you know whether we think that they're appropriately ranked or not, and kind of giving you a little insight into each team. And then we're going to talk about a Week 0 recap here with the games that just happened yesterday, and then we're going to give you one sleeper team each that we think could make their way into the top 5 come the end of the year. So with that said, I'm going to throw it over to you, Kriv, and let you get us started.
All right, Coop, thank you. And as he said, I am Kriv, and we are going to get started here with number one, who, of course, by no surprise, is Georgia. In my opinion, Georgia definitely deserving of that top spot. Before they lost to Alabama last year, they legitimately won 29 straight games before that. They lost a single game. And with that being said, they're returning 16 starters. That's an incredible amount of players to return on a team that has won so much in the past few years.
Absolutely.
Obviously, yeah, and obviously the biggest key to that return is Carson Beck. Uh, Currently number 2 in Heisman odds, but honestly, I don't think it would surprise anyone if he won the Heisman. He might honestly be the favorite if it wasn't for a few outside factors there, but the defense absolutely loaded with Malachi Starks. They do have a tough schedule though. So even though they have all these returning players with a ton of experience, they have to play some very, very tough road games. They have to play at Alabama, at Texas, and at Ole Miss. Alabama, obviously, the number 5 team in the country. Even without Nick Saban, that's going to be a tough one. At Texas, I mean, going into that stadium, Texas will be rocking, and they are loaded as well. Another top 4 team. And then you have number 6 Ole Miss. That's a dangerous team. They got a lot of talent. So we'll get into some of those teams a little bit later, but Georgia, top to bottom, very strong team. I think they are deserving of the number 1 ranking currently. They have the track record and they have the returning players. What do you think, Hoop?
Yeah, no, I think you made a lot of great points there, honestly, and you touch on a lot of what I'm going to kind of, reiterate here in my take on Georgia. But, first and foremost, like you said, Carson Beck returning is just an absolutely massive win for Georgia. Because when you think about it, whether it's at the collegiate level or if it's at the professional level, the quarterback position is the most important position in the game. Carson Beck looked great last year. Like you said, he's second in Heisman voting, only second to Dylan Gabriel as of this recording. With that being said, though, he very easily could win it. Like you touched on, he's going to be phenomenal this year. Again, loaded defense, as you mentioned, with Malachi Starks. And then I think something that's, maybe not completely overlooked, but something that's going to be important is the addition of transfer running back Trevor Etienne from Florida. I think that he is going to help that team exponentially. Not that they need it, they're incredibly talented as it is, but I think that that is kind of overlooked when you're just looking at this team top to bottom of how important that transfer is actually going to be for them. And they've been the most dominant team in the sport over the last 5 years. Kind of taken that reign from Alabama as being the most dominant team in the sport year in and year out over the last 5 years. Recruiting's been off the charts. As you mentioned, though, they've got a really difficult schedule, and that's by SEC standards, which we know every year the SEC is going to be a gauntlet. And it's an incredibly difficult schedule, even by those SEC standards. They've got road games, as you mentioned, at Texas, Alabama, and Ole Miss. Both Texas and Alabama, 2 teams we're going to touch on here in just a minute, are both ranked inside the AP top 5 rather in this first ranking. So that's an incredibly difficult schedule. I don't think Georgia goes through that unscathed, but they don't need to go through that unscathed. I don't think that any team in the country would go through that schedule unscathed. And so they will absolutely find themselves in the 12-team playoff. I would not be surprised to see them hoisting that trophy in the SEC as the SEC champions and finding themselves having a first round bye come the 12-team playoff once we get there. But not a problem with them being ranked number 1. They would be my number 1 team as well if I had any kind of vote or say. So not a problem whatsoever. And with that said, I'm sure you're under the same opinion, with what you touched on. So let's jump
Yeah,
on
and
into number 2 unless you have something to say.
Yeah, and just real quick, going back to a few things you mentioned, especially with the quarterback position, Carson Beck is probably going to be the top quarterback taken in next year's draft if all things go as planned. So,
Yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
very high end talent, and then the addition of Trevor Etienne is big. I really do think so. When he was at Florida, he was the offense. He was the guy. A lot of what they did ran through him, and now he is just a luxury part of the Georgia offense there. So very excited to
Yeah,
see what they can do there. But yeah, there's some very very talented players on that side of the ball for them, and they're
absolutely.
they're they're, they're going to be dangerous.
Absolutely. And you know what? Love or hate the transfer portal and what has become of college football. I mean, just look at the storyline of a Florida running back or a Florida player in general transferring to Georgia. I mean, we all know the history of that rivalry. I mean, could you imagine saying that, you know, 5, 10 years ago, even if, the transfer portal didn't exist, just having one of those players transfer to that team it's just absolutely wild to me, whether you love or hate the transfer portal. The fact that you have a Florida player transferring into a Georgia program is just the absolute chaos, and I kind of love it. So I'm excited to see what he and that team do this year.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you look at the top five teams here, especially Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, I mean, these teams all tapped into that portal, and that really brings us to our number two in the AP poll, Ohio State. Honestly, they're arguably team 1B if there was such a thing, but they are two, which is probably fair, all things considered, with Georgia and their track record. But they tapped into that portal. You have their starting quarterback, Will Howard from Kansas State, Judkins from Ole Miss. I mean, these guys are experienced transfers who have a lot of success. And you can't, of course, you can't talk about the transfer portal in Ohio State without mentioning Alabama transfer Caleb Downs, who arguably is the best safety in the game and possibly one of the best defensive players in all of college football. So they really tapped into that, but that's just for me in Ohio State. They played the transfer portal where they targeted their weaknesses and got top end talent for those spots. They didn't
Yep.
go overboard though. They just, I think their total transfer count is like 6 or 7 players total. But it seems like they did a lot more because they got arguably the best running back and best safety and one of the best quarterbacks available. So they really took advantage of it in a smart way without completely overhauling the roster. They have tons of returning talent and a strong culture for the most part. So you look at on offense, you have Judkins, but then you have Trevion Henderson. Together, they might be the number 1 and 2 running backs in the country. Uh, if they're not, they're definitely the best duo in the country. So that
Yeah.
alone should
Absolutely.
be great for them. I think adding Chip Kelly, who has kind of developed his offense around running the ball, they're gonna really thrive off that and probably lean on that throughout the year, especially bringing in Will Howard, who can actually run the ball too, which is a element that Ohio State really hasn't had at quarterback since Justin Fields. Um, Not a
Sure.
slight to CJ Stroud at all, but in college football it adds an element, of course, that can kind of change the game. So definitely think they're ranked appropriately. They have a few question marks. The offensive line, the depth there, but I mean that defense is loaded. You got JTT, Jack Sawyer, Denzel Burke. I mean they got some real studs on that side. So
Yeah.
excited to see what they can do, and
Absolutely.
we might see a clash of the Titans again, like a few years ago in the Peach Bowl there. So
Yeah,
we'll
for
see what
sure.
happens, but they can do a lot of damage. Very dangerous.
Yeah, that game in the Peach Bowl a couple of years ago was the de facto national championship as we look back hindsight there. But no, I think everything that you just touched on is correct when it comes to Ohio State. As you mentioned, you could argue make a team 1B to Georgia, that you could easily make an argument that this team is the number one team in the country. And I think something that really points to this, and maybe not something that a lot of people think about, is when you look at this top five, at least in my opinion, Ohio State probably has the weakest quarterback of all five teams because you've got Carson Beck, you have Dylan Gabriel, you have Quinn Ewers, and then you've got Jalen Milroe for Alabama. And not that's not a shot at Will Howard whatsoever. I think Will Howard is going to fit in very nicely with this Ohio State team. But the fact that you can make an argument that they have the weakest of all of the quarterbacks in the top five, yet they find themselves ranked number two, hits on all the points you talked about with just how talented this team is top to bottom on both sides of the ball, both defensively and offensively. It's one of the better rosters potentially that we've seen in college football over the last several decades, which really says something when you think about all those phenomenal Nick Saban Alabama teams, some of these Kirby Smart Georgia teams, some of the Dabo Swinney Clemson teams. Like this team is loaded, and they've got, as you mentioned, probably the best running back duo in all of college football. You have Trevion Henderson, who's just an absolute workhorse back there. And then he steps out and takes a breather, and the defense is like, okay, finally, we're going to get a little bit of a break. And wait, here comes Quinshon Judkins, the transfer running back from Ole Miss. It's just a plethora of riches for this Ohio State team on both sides of the ball. Something that I think, it has been talked about, with other podcasts out here. But that's the fact that I think that this team could operate very similarly to what Michigan did last year. That might be something that, kind of makes Ohio State fans cringe a little bit, but you're going to have a stellar defense, probably the best running back duo in all of college football, and then a quarterback back there that doesn't need to be a superstar like a Justin Fields or a CJ Stroud for Ohio State when we're doing comparisons to their past quarterbacks. Someone like Cam Newton, Caleb Williams with USC, like he doesn't need to be that guy. He needs to be somebody that can just operate the offense, make minimal mistakes, and I think Ohio State will find themselves playing very deeply into this 12-team playoff and very well could find themselves as the national champions at the end of the year. Their question marks are going to be on the offensive line as well as the quarterback position, which I touched on a little bit. But again, Will Howard doesn't need to be superhuman. And I think their offensive line rather is going to be quite good. They just do not have a lot of depth at that position. So if they sustain some injuries, you could find yourself in a little bit of a precarious position. But overall, not a problem at all with them being ranked number two. Totally agree with you that I think you could have a clash of the Titans if seeding goes correctly. You could find yourself having Georgia, Ohio State in the national championship game, or you could have it earlier on, depending on what happens and who's conference winners and kind of where things fall. And last thing I'll touch on with this team, and it's something that you touched on, and I really think that it was a great point. The hire of Chip Kelly, I think, is one of the most underrated things that they did this offseason. Because everyone talks about bringing in Quinshon Judkins and Caleb Downs, and rightfully so. Two phenomenal players, two of the best players in all of college football that came through the transfer portal this year. But hiring Chip Kelly, Ryan Day's right-hand man, someone that he trusts more than anyone else to run the offense, and one thing that Chip Kelly loves to do is run the football, and that's been somewhat of a weakness for Ohio State over the last several years. Chip Kelly ran the football down opponents' throats with UCLA, and he's going to have far superior talent at Ohio State. So I'm really excited to see that. I think it's going to bode very well for them, not only in the Big Ten, but deep into the postseason. So appropriately ranked at number two, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I just to kind of talk about the Chip Kelly edition a little bit here. Ryan Day has always been head coach and offensive coordinator and play caller in reality. Yep. So we've never seen a Ryan Day CEO type of role where he of course still has his hands on the offense, but he is making a point of controlling team culture, being involved in other rooms on the team. So like defensively, he's actually over there. He's not spending all his time with the offense or all his time with the quarterbacks. So it's gonna be interesting to see how the team looks with Ryan Day being kind of more free flowing and able to build those relationships and culture throughout the entire team instead of maybe where he was kind of isolated beforehand. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think that's a great point, because one of the things that's plagued Ohio State over the years has just been the fact that Ryan Day's been trying to do too much and has had resistance to letting go of the reins. You can't be the CEO, the CFO, and the CMO all at the same time. I think he's really going to flourish having officially let go of the reins of some of those other positions that he was holding and just fully embracing that head coach role and leader of the program and the team. I think it's going to pay dividends for them. I really do. I think that that's an underrated thing that you just mentioned, and I think it's going to be very big for them this entire year and moving forward.
Yeah, and real quick before we jump over to number three here, I did want to go back to your Will Howard analysis, and I agree on the surface, he probably is considered to most as the weakest. And one thing I want people to keep in mind, though, is that he played at Kansas State with very, very little talent around him.
Sure. Especially
We might
compared to
not,
Ohio State.
yeah, absolutely. It's night and day. So while Will Howard has played a lot of football and we have a lot of tape on him, we've never seen him, one, in an offense designed like a Ryan Day offense, and then two, just having the talent around him, the Jeremiah Smiths, the Emeka Egbuka. I mean, he is probably smiling ear to ear with the talent around him. So,
Yeah. And yeah, and one thing you've heard, whether you're an Ohio State fan or not, or you're just a fan of college football, coming out of spring game and summer training here for Ohio State, is Will Howard has made significant strides. And you mentioned it. You got guys like Denzel Burke. You have Caleb Downs. You have a nasty defense, especially on the back end, and you've got those guys saying that Will Howard has kind of got that dog mentality in him and is really leading the team now, and that's something that Ohio State fans are probably smiling ear to ear, as you mentioned, earlier, because that's something that they've kind of been lacking from that leadership role, specifically at that position over the last year or two. You saw that occasionally with CJ Stroud, but you didn't always see it. And we all know his talent level, and not just what he's doing in the NFL now, but what he did at Ohio State was incredible. But he didn't always have that dog mentality, and you're hearing some of those players like Denzel Burke, who I think embodies that mentality, talk about Will Howard in that way, and I think that can pay dividends for Ohio State down the line. So it's going to be really interesting to see.
yeah, absolutely. And we'll see that play out pretty soon here. But moving to number three here is Oregon. And for me, I really do think that they are appropriately ranked, and they definitely are one of those teams that could end up hoisting the trophy at the end of the year. They were already really talented last year. They ran into a buzzsaw with Michael Penix and Washington. Obviously, yep. They lost Bo Nix, but they added Dylan Gabriel, who just so happens to be number one in Heisman odds as of today. I don't think he's necessarily like a top end talent like Carson Beck, but if you've watched him play before, he is very efficient and he finds ways to get the ball into the hands of his playmakers, which is really, I mean, if he can do that, Oregon's going to be very dangerous. Sure. Obviously, they have Tez Johnson already on the team returning. They added Evan Stewart from Texas A&M, so they got some weapons there where he should be able to take advantage of that. And speaking of the transfer portal, I mean, Oregon kind of had a Ohio State type approach, kind of grabbing some top end talent, and also they grabbed a player from a rival team. They got Jabbar Muhammad at cornerback from Washington. I mean, yeah, the portal has just thrown these rivalries into the wind, and these guys are, I hate to say it, but going to the highest bidder, but huge pickup for them there. And then defensive line, they got a stud in Derek Harmon from Michigan State. I mean, the talent they added to what the talent they had, I mean, they are very good. And the one interesting part, though, is, of course, joining the Big Ten. And not that they can't compete in the Big Ten, that's not it at all, but just the dynamics of them being on the West Coast and having to go across the country for however many games, that's going to be a challenge. These are new stadiums, new game day environments that the coaches, the players, they just haven't seen. So that'll be very interesting. Of course, it goes the other way because October 12th, the matchup that I think a lot of people are excited to see when they'll play OSU. I mean, that's going to be a fight of the top of the college football world, and whoever wins that is probably going to carry a lot of momentum. It wouldn't surprise me if those teams met again. But yeah, I think Oregon definitely appropriately ranked at 3, has top end potential. Uh, yeah, it's going to be a very, very interesting season for them for sure. What do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I kind of gave you some little tidbits of approval during what you were talking about with Oregon there, and I fully agree with all the points that you hit on. And one of the things I'll touch on real quick before I kind of jump into talking about them as a whole is I think when you look at Oregon and Dan Lanning, one of the things that people hold over Dan Lanning and Oregon is you lost twice last year to Washington, your two biggest games. And they say, you lost twice last year to Washington. Why should we believe that you can do it this year? And in my opinion, in watching those games, number one, Michael Penix Jr. was just phenomenal. I mean, we all saw what he did at Indiana, and then he goes to a place like Washington where he has significantly more talent, and he just lights up the college football world. I mean, he was just stupendous last year. Um, but I don't think that has as much to do with Oregon as I think that Washington was just a really bad matchup for Oregon. I don't think it speaks ill to Dan Lanning in Oregon as a program. I think that Washington was just a very bad matchup for them last year, and unfortunately, they came out losers in both of those contests. They were highly competitive contests. Meanwhile, they were not blowouts by any mean. Oregon was competitive in them. I just think that Washington was a nightmare matchup for Oregon. So I just wanted to touch on that because I've seen put out there, why should we believe in Dan Lanning in Oregon when they haven't done it in their biggest games. They've got the talent and all of that and the skill position players, and they've got studs in the trenches on both sides of the ball, but they haven't done it in the big games. And the same could be said for Ohio State and Ryan Day in some of those games, but I fully believe in that program as well. So I just wanted to put that out there that I fully agree. I think Oregon at number 3 is completely fair. They're absolutely loaded with top end talent. Adding Dillon Gabriel through the transfer portal, along with elite wide receiver Evan Stewart from Texas A&M, I think is going to just be an absolute fireworks show for Oregon and college football this year. Like Evan Stewart, former 5-star recruit at Texas A&M, he wasn't nearly as highlighted as he could have been, and I think that's just because Texas A&M under Jimbo Fisher was not reaching anywhere close to their maximum potential with the talent that they had on board. I think you're going to see Evan Stewart really, really take off this year, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Evan Stewart as a Boitnikoff finalist and or potential winner come the end of the year. I think he's going to be phenomenal, and I think Dillon Gabriel is going to elevate him, and I think Evan Stewart's going to elevate Dillon Gabriel. So I think they're going to be a great duo to watch this year. And I think they're going to be a matchup, nightmare for most opponents. And, I think some people have kind of this notion that Oregon is a finesse team. These old Oregon teams, like they've got speed on the outside and they're going to get kind of cute and, do all these trick plays and they're not going to be able to hang in the trenches with the Big Ten. Mario Cristobal really started this when he was at Oregon before departing for the University of Miami. He started building big powerhouse guys on both sides of the ball, offensive line and defensive line. And Cristobal has come in and only elevated that further. So I don't think there's a notion out there that Oregon's not going to be able to hang in the trenches with the rest of the Big Ten. I don't think that that's true at all. I think that they've gotten big on both sides of the ball in the trenches, and I think that they're going to do just fine. Before kind of wrapping up and going to number 4, Texas here, that matchup week 7 with Ohio State is going to be an absolute slugfest. It's going to be an absolute dogfight, clash of the Titans. I personally think the winner of that game, I think those two teams meet again in the Big Ten championship, at least looking at it right now. I think the winner of that game does not go on to win the Big Ten championship. So whoever wins that game, I think they meet again in the Big Ten championship. And then I think the other team goes on to win the Big Ten championship, whoever that may be. And we may talk about that later down the line as that game gets closer on one of our podcasts here. But I think those two teams to me are head and shoulders above the rest of the Big Ten right now. And it's going to be a very, very interesting year. And I know college football is never easy to predict and all, we're talking about uncertainties right now. But right now, I think Oregon firmly cemented as the number 3 team in the country. And I've got absolutely no qualms about it. I feel very confident that is, worst a 10-2 team, at best a 12-0 team. And I feel the same way about the two we've already talked about previously. So
Yeah, and I think Ohio State and Oregon are going to become very familiar with each other real fast, being in the same conference. So
yeah,
both teams recruiting at a super high level. I mean, they just have unlimited funds for NIL, so
that's a great
they're
point.
they're going head to head on and off the field for a lot. So
Yeah.
it'll be very interesting.
Yeah, and that last point you made before we move on to Texas here is a great point. Whether you're a fan of NIL or not, or whether you think there should be a cap limit or not, that's a discussion for another day. But out of basically anyone in the country, Oregon's going to be set up to be poised to be the top echelon in NIL. When you got Phil Knight as your head guy in NIL, the possibilities are endless when it comes to NIL money right now because there's no cap. And so if you're Oregon, I mean, you got Phil Knight, you got the perfect person at the helm to kind of steer the ship of your NIL fund and go get those best players in the country, whether it be in the transfer portal or coming straight out of high school.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, he's a game changer, and that Nike money is not to be taken lightly for sure. So, but yeah, as you mentioned, at number 4 we have Texas. I tend to think they're just about right. Maybe 4 and 5 here could be interchangeable to an extent.
Sure.
For me, the season kind of hinges on Quinn Ewers, former number 1 overall recruit. He had a pretty good year last year. I mean, he went into Alabama and put on a show and played one of his best games. If they get that Quinn Ewers, they're going to be very, very dangerous, and they can compete for a national title. I think when you look at their early schedule, they have some tough games, and obviously joining the SEC, we don't know how that's going to play out. They're probably used to playing a few easy games here and there. There's not many days off when you're in the SEC, so. But for me, and I think you probably have this similar idea here, Quinn Ewers not only being key, but if he doesn't do well early on, there's going to be those chants saying, Arch Manning, let's go. It's your time. This team's a loaded roster. They don't have those fans aren't going to have a whole lot of patience if you're not performing. So I think Quinn can do it, and I don't think the Arch Manning calls will get too loud, but no matter what happens, that's going to be in the back of his head. That's going to be in the back of the coach's head. So keep an eye out for that. Outside of that, I think them losing CJ Baxter was a pretty big loss. Luckily for them, their running back room pretty good, so they could offset it a little bit. But CJ Baxter's a stud. It's terrible that he's going to miss the whole year. But yeah, it's going to be sink or swim in the SEC, and we're going to find out very quickly if they can hang with them. I think they can. There might be a little bit of an adjustment with that week in, week out playing top end talent, but once again, I think Texas is ranked well at 4. Maybe they should be 5, but yeah, I tend to agree with that ranking.
Yeah, no, I think you made just a lot of great points there, and I'm absolutely going to touch on a lot of those, specifically the Quinn Ewers versus Arch Manning debate here. But, I'll kind of start out here and say that I'm fine with Texas at 4. I absolutely think they're a top 5 team. I think you made a great point. Whether you want to interchange Texas and Alabama at 4 or 5, you wouldn't get much of a pushback from myself, and it sounds like the same for you. One of the things that you did touch on, and it's unfortunate, and it's just a part of the game, but Texas has been hit by that injury bug, specifically at the running back position during training camp. However, with that being said, Quinn Ewers, I think, is an absolute stud. He's returning. Talent they have surrounding him, I know they lost a lot of their wide receiver talent, and they're kind of banking on some transfer guys, but Texas doesn't have to rebuild. Texas is a brand and recruits well enough that they can just reload like any of the other top teams in the country. So I think Quinn Ewers coming back with that experience and just the pure talent that he has is going to pay huge dividends for them. Again, like I touched on, they lost a lot of talent. They lost a lot of production, especially on their respective lines. But they don't have to rebuild. They just reload. The 2 biggest questions, week 2 matchup at Michigan. We know Michigan lost a ton of talent to the NFL draft after winning the national championship last year. However, week 2, early on in the year, having to go up to Ann Arbor rather, no easy feat. And that's not some guaranteed Texas is going to walk in and just dog walk Michigan. That's not a guarantee, even though Michigan has major question marks at the quarterback position. And they lost, Blake Corum, obviously JJ McCarthy, which is why they have the questions at the quarterback position. That defense as a whole is going to be elite. That defensive line is going to be stacked. So that is a big hurdle to get over. I ultimately do think that Texas, probably will be fine in that game, but it's no cakewalk for them, even with all that Michigan lost. And then again, like you said, if things are not going well, let's say just for argument's sake, they lose that week 2 matchup, or they don't look as dominant as people think that they should as the, consensus number 4 team in these first initial rankings, how loud are those calls for Arch Manning going to get? Because if there's any program, not just in the top 5, but just in America in general, that has the most outside noise, whether it's from its fan base, its boosters, or its administration, it's Texas. Like, there is so little control from the head coach to the rest of that staff in terms of comparing them to these other top tier programs. The boosters, the fan base, the administration, they have so much more of a say with this program than you hear all of these other programs have. And so if things aren't going well, I think the calls for Arch Manning are going to get really loud. And whether or not Steve Sarkisian listens to them, you have to imagine that that's going to play and affect Quinn Ewers. Whether he's a dog and incredibly talented or not, if people are calling for you to be replaced, can only imagine how hard that may be to ignore. So I think Texas is a very good team. Fully expect them in the 12-team playoff. Would not be surprised whatsoever to see them as the SEC champions come the end of the regular season. But it's going to be a very interesting year for them because there's going to be a lot of outside noise, especially if things kind of fall off the rails a little bit for them. So really, really interested to see them. They're one of the more intriguing teams for me to kind of pay attention to this year.
Yeah, and to clarify my point earlier, and you kind of just touched on it too. I know Texas is talented enough for the SEC. In fact, they're possibly the most talented team in the SEC. It's just a matter of fact that the talent hasn't needed to play SEC level talent week in, week out. And that's going to be the interesting part. I think they are top tier team. But that's the element I'm more focused on as opposed to their actual roster. I think their roster is phenomenal. And like you said, they don't rebuild, they reload. So they're going to have a very good season. They're just going to have to get used to the gauntlet of the SEC.
Yeah, I mean, and we talked about it. Like we said that Georgia has an extremely difficult schedule, even by SEC standards. And we mentioned it, that the SEC week in and week out, for the most part, aside from a few teams, is a gauntlet every single year. And so you're correct. With Texas and Oklahoma having previously been in the Big 12, it was really, they were the big two in that conference. And they didn't have to go in to, a dogfight week in and week out. And that's something that Texas, they have a pretty favorable schedule this year, in their first year in the SEC. But it's still not going to be any kind of like cakewalk weeks, week to week, like they had sometimes in that Big 12 conference. So I do think that that's going to be interesting to see both for them and for Oklahoma. So I'm really excited to see how both of them adjust to being in the SEC. I think Texas is a little more equipped to do that than Oklahoma, at least at this point in time, just with the pure talent that they have. But it's going to be interesting to see how they kind of adjust to this new conference.
Yeah, and on that note, I mean, the number 5 team is a name we're all familiar with, Alabama, who, besides Georgia, has been the face of SEC football for the last decade. Obviously, They are very different because Nick Saban is, of course, no longer there. The Caleb DeBoer hire, I feel like, was a pretty good one. Replacing Nick Saban's impossible. However, I do kind of want to say, like, I feel like what Caleb DeBoer is coming into is very similar to Ryan Day taking over at Ohio State. Urban Meyer had built a juggernaut while there. He recruited at the highest level. Of course, the difference being Ryan Day was actually part of the staff and became head coach. So that familiarity was more of an advantage for a guy like Ryan Day as opposed to DeBoer coming in from the outside. But the point is that there's an existing foundation there. A lot of these players played under Nick Saban for multiple seasons. They know what that culture is and what it takes to win. That doesn't go away overnight just because the head coach left. Nick Saban left a lasting impact on the players that are still there today. And that's going to help them a lot this first season. The biggest thing is Jalen Milroe coming back with another year of experience and being put into that Washington Michael Penix offense. Now, I'm not saying Jalen Milroe can throw like Michael Penix. I don't think he can. But I think that Caleb DeBoer knows enough on the offensive side on how to maximize Milroe's talent. And maybe he does see that next step or that improvement in the passing game. That's really going to be the X factor for Alabama. If Jalen Milroe can find that passing game, even some semblance of it similar to Michael Penix, which is a tall task, that's going to transform this Alabama team. Obviously, they lost some players in the transfer portal. They did add some really good incoming freshmen. Losing Caleb Downs, of course, you can't replace that, but they are so deep players that they should be able to overcome that to an extent. And for me, this is where I kind of felt like Texas and Alabama were interchangeable. I think the biggest thing is that foundation. These guys have played and won SEC championships before on the Alabama roster. That's going to help the transition and carry over to the next regime here. So for me personally, I mean, they're very close in talent, Alabama and Texas. I think Alabama should be 4 just because they've done it in the conference. They have the talent. So, but once again, Jalen Milroe and Caleb DeBoer's relationship and how they mold that offense will be key. And I think they can figure it out, to be honest. It'll be very interesting to see. And if they do figure it out, look out.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You touched on so much of what I'm going to kind of reiterate and touch on here. But I fully agree with all of your points. And, to start off, like, yes, losing Nick Saban it cannot be overstated how massive that is. But you touched on it perfectly. He built a foundation at that program and instituted something of excellence that the next person that came in to take over the helm was going to instantly be set up for success. It's going to guarantee success for Kalen DeBoer and the Alabama Crimson Tide. And Kalen DeBoer is no slouch. Came from Washington, and he's been a winner everywhere he's gone. And he won at Washington with significantly less talent than what he's inheriting at Alabama. These guys have done it, as you mentioned. They're incredibly talented. Oh, and by the way, their recruiting has not taken a step back in the slightest since Kalen DeBoer took over. Like, that program is just going to continue to churn out top talent and top team year after year after year. So I'm in full agreement with you that perfectly fine with them being ranked in the top 5. Very well could make an argument that they could be in the top 4. As you said, they've really have run the SEC over the last 2+ decades. I know I touched on it earlier that, Georgia's kind of overtaken the throne as the king of college football over the last 4 or 5 years. But that was Alabama for the last 2 decades under Nick Saban, since he took over. And so I would also have Alabama at 4 and Texas at 5, but I'm fine with interchanging them. I mean, we mentioned that when we talked about Texas as well. And I think that I think ultimately they may end up as the 3rd best team in the conference. And I know I had them potentially over Texas at 4 versus 5. And that's strictly because I think Carson Beck is better than Jalen Milroe, and I think Quinn Ewers is better than Jalen Milroe. And so I would probably have them as the 3rd best team in the conference this year, but I would not be shocked to see them in the 12-team playoff. Except, in fact, I actually expect to see them in the 12-team playoff. I fully expect 3 teams from the SEC at least to be in the SEC, or to be in that 12-team playoff rather, and that's Georgia, Texas, and Alabama. And I would not be shocked to see a 4th and potentially a 5th. We'll have to see how the season plays out, and I fully expect Alabama to be one of those teams. And they get Georgia at home, their most difficult game, and playing at Bryant-Denny Stadium is no easy feat, and Georgia very well could find themselves being the number 1 team in the country at that point in time, and Alabama could find themselves as the number 5 team in the country, number 4 team in the country. We'll see what happens come, game week that week. But that place is going to be absolutely rocking, and I think it's going to be a real dangerous game for Georgia. And you never want to say that playing Alabama is a trap game, because Alabama is just Alabama, as both you and I mentioned. So they're no slouch, and they won't be a slouch anytime soon. But I think that game is a real shot of not only, Alabama winning that game, but I could see them, potentially winning by a touchdown or more. I would not be surprised to see that result when that game happens. And I'm very excited to see it. I'm very excited to see Kalen DeBoer in his first season at Alabama. That's a fan base similar to Ohio State, similar to Georgia, that will not accept not even mediocrity, but will not even accept 10-2 year after year after year, especially after what they had under Nick Saban. So if Kalen DeBoer does not succeed the way that you and I both think that he will, the calls for a change at the head coach position will come significantly quicker at a place like Alabama or any of these other top tier programs than it would elsewhere, than it would when he was at Washington, for example. So it's going to be really interesting. There's so many storylines with all 5 of these teams that we've touched on here. So I'm so excited to get week 1 this upcoming weekend underway and just start to see, where we end up and kind of what this journey looks like.
Yeah,
this
absolutely.
New era of playoff football.
Absolutely. And I think one of the best things about this conference realignment, especially going over this top 5, we're going to see these matchups happen in the regular season. And we don't have to wait for a bowl game or a committee to give us these matchups. They're just going to happen. And that's
Absolutely
the beauty of the new format and the new alignment. So I'm pumped. This is going to be a fun season. And with the 12-team playoff, I mean, you could lose a game or two and you're not out. So it's going to be a dogfight the whole year for all these teams. But the great thing is we're going to see a lot of good matchups, and it's all going to play out on the field.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with you. It's going to be an incredible season of college football, and just can't wait to get it started. And we did get it started this past weekend, and we'll touch on the week 0 games here in just a little bit. But before we get into that, you and I both have a sleeper team that is not inside of the top 5 that we think very well could find their way inside of the top 5 come the end of the year when we are getting ready to seed the 12-team playoff. So if you would like me to go first, I'm more than happy to. If you want to jump in and go first, whatever you want to do is totally fine.
Coop, let's hear it, man. I want to hear your sleeper.
All right, my sleeper team here, and it might not be the craziest sleeper team, but it's a team and a program of great prominence a long time ago that has really fallen off and has not had much success over the last several decades here. And that's going to be the University of Miami, the U. And I know a lot of people are gonna sit here and say, like, I don't trust them. They've not been good, elite since those teams of the 80s that were just absolutely nasty. The team in 2002 that lost the national championship to Ohio State. I don't trust Mario Cristobal. And I agree on the Mario Cristobal front that he's probably good for at least 1 or 2 losses every year by some boneheaded mistake like the ones that he made last year that cost Miami a couple of games. However, and we'll touch on this game later, after seeing the absolute dud that Florida State put up against Georgia Tech, I don't think Georgia Tech is any kind of formidable opponent. So I'm not going to be sitting here saying, oh, they beat Florida State, Georgia Tech's going to win the ACC. I think the ACC is wide open. And with these Big Four conferences, the conference winner is going to be one of the top 4 teams and is going to get a bye, because the group of 5 team is automatically the 12th seed. So they're not eligible for a bye. So whoever wins the ACC is going to be one of those top 4 teams, probably number 4, because I think the winner of the Big Ten and or SEC will be 1-2, and then maybe Big 12 probably going to take that 3rd spot. We'll see in the end. And after seeing Florida State put up that dud against Georgia Tech, I don't fully believe in Clemson. I know that sounds crazy because of all the great teams they had, not too long ago under Dabo Swinney. I don't fully believe in Clemson and Cade Klubnik at this point in time. I know they're going to have a good defense and a really good defensive line, so it could absolutely be them. Could be someone like Louisville, but there's nothing that's telling me why it can't be the University of Miami coming out of the ACC right now, and they're ranked number 19 in this initial AP poll. So that's my team that I feel could find their way into the top 5 come the end of the year. Now, that doesn't mean I think that they're one of the 5 best teams in the country. I don't. Unless I see something amazing from Cam Ward in them this year, which I don't expect to see, I don't think that they're going to be one of the 5 best teams, but I think that they could find themselves in the top 5 winning the ACC. So that is my team.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good sleeper pick. I mean, I just have not seen it on the field with them the last few years. I mean, they recruit at the highest level. They get transfer players at the highest level. On paper, they should absolutely be a top 5 team. And I think the reason you don't see them in the AP preseason poll that high is because we have not seen it on the field. Could it all come together finally? I mean, it's possible. I think Cam Ward was a great pickup. He's a very talented quarterback who has a good amount of experience. I mean, it could happen. I think it's a good pick. It would not shock me at all if it happened, but like I kind of just said, I mean, I just need to see it to believe it. But
for sure. And me too. And it was a real Sophie's choice trying to make that decision. Trust me, it was no easy feat for me to actually come down with that team. But that's ultimately what I ended on.
Wait till you hear who I'm about to pick. So
I'm excited.
I'm either going to look really smart or no one will listen to me ever again. So
that's not great since this is our first podcast. So let's hope it's the first one.
Yeah. Please give me a chance, everyone. So this pick is a team that has had some good success. They're not a perennial powerhouse. They definitely don't recruit at the highest level, but they are ranked in the top 15. In fact, they're ranked in the top 12. And if we were to go by the AP poll, they would be in the playoff. And that team is the Utah Utes.
Now, I like it.
That team, if you've watched them over the past few years, they are gritty. They are grit personified. And that all starts with Kyle Whittingham. He has been in that program for a very long time, and he has built such a good culture. And one of the reasons I'm picking them, though, is because they got their quarterback back, finally. And this quarterback... Yeah, exactly. He's been in college football longer than Van Wilder. So he is Cam Rising. I mean, if you've watched him these last few years when he's been healthy, he is a game changer for them on the field. He is that college quarterback who just gets it done somehow. You're never out of it. He finds a way. And the other part, too, I was looking at their schedule, and as of today, they only play 2 ranked teams, Oklahoma State and Arizona. So strength of schedule, I mean, they could possibly not. They're definitely not going to coast. They're going to have a lot of tough games just because of their talent level. But they're set up for success and for that ability to maybe sneak into that top 5. It wouldn't be the craziest thing if they pulled that off. They do have some tough games against teams that aren't ranked, but could be a challenge, like TCU and Houston and even Colorado at Colorado. I mean, we don't know what's going to come of that situation there, but I just think there's a lot of things going well for them. They have a good roster, strong run game, and Cam Rising and Whittingham at the helm. I mean, who knows what they can do? I mean, they've played spoiler the last few years. They've made it to the Rose Bowl. They can definitely sneak into that top 5. I don't think they're a top 5 talented team, but that's just the team I have as a sleeper that could sneak into that spot.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I've got no way to argue that. And I agree with you with everything that you said about Utah. They've got a really good to great college quarterback with a lot of experience in Cam Rising. Kyle Whittingham and his Utah Utes personify what it means to be tough and have grit. And then something that I think, that I didn't hear you touch on, but is potentially overlooked is, yeah, they're in the Big 12 conference now, but playing at Utah in that elevation is no easy feat for teams that have to go in and do that. And so that is a significant advantage at home games for the Utah Utes that they'll have over their opponents if they get it home this year. So that's a very interesting team, similar to my team with the U. And I think both of what we did, I'm glad we went to different conferences, but I think going to the ACC and then going to the Big 12 is what obviously made the most sense because, again, that group of 5 team is automatically the 12 seed, so they're not eligible. And then the rest of the top 5 is made up of the Big 10 and the SEC. And so thinking that it's going to be one of those other teams coming from one of those conferences, not to say it's impossible, could maybe be a Penn State or something along those lines, or an Ole Miss from the SEC. It's not impossible. But I think going to the ACC and the Big 12 was the logical choice here because whoever wins either one of those conferences is going to find themselves inside of the top 4. And no team from either of those conferences finds themselves even in the top, let's see, in the top 10. The number 10 seed was FSU. That was the first team from the ACC and or Big 12. The rest are all from the Big 10, the SEC, and then independent Notre Dame. So I think it's going to be interesting to see. I'm really, really excited for that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, these are sleepers, but I mean, if we've seen anything in college football, anything can happen. So
Absolutely.
just be
Absolutely.
ready.
That's right. That's right. You always got to be on your toes and expect the unexpected in college football for sure. And, with that being said, we're going to kind of wrap it up here, but go over and briefly touch on the week 0 games here, which I think rightfully so. Number one, we just want to chat about the games because we love college football and sports in general. But at the same time, there were some surprises in here. And if you said that there weren't, then you are the smartest human alive, or you're lying. So let's jump in. And I think the one that we got to talk about the most, kind of the most consequential game, is going to be Florida State and Georgia Tech, with Georgia Tech pulling off the upset over Florida State. And Florida State, as I mentioned, was ranked number 10 in the initial AP poll. We know they won't be there when the second poll comes out because they lost to Georgia Tech. But this one really surprised me, and I'm sure it was the same for you. Like, I fully expected Florida State to cover the 11-point spread in this game. We both touched on, when we talked about this before recording, traveling overseas is never easy, but it was going to be both teams that were having to go through that. And top to bottom, Florida State looked to have the more talented team, and they still do have the more talented team from a composite talent standpoint, but they did not look like the better team at all in that game. I thought that they were going to rely heavily on their run game and their defense, and I thought both their offensive and defensive line were going to be too much for Georgia Tech to handle, and they were going to really push them around, and that just absolutely was not the case. Something that did surprise me is that Georgia Tech has won 4 of the last 7, now 5 of the last 8 meetings between these two teams. So maybe I should have given, Georgia Tech a little bit more credit and give them their flowers when due. But it was a real shock to me, and I have a significant amount of respect for Florida State, and to say I was not kind of floored by this result would be a lie. And I think something that really kind of surprised me, and I think it wasn't their complete demise, but they found themselves in a lot of second and long situations in this game, and they decided to run the ball, putting themselves then in pretty third and unmanageable situations. And I think that was not an adequate game plan, especially for a quarterback like DJ Uiagalelei, who, number one, is having his first game in this new system, transferring from Oregon State after he transferred from Clemson to Oregon State. And while I think that he has flashes and moments compared to what he was ranked coming out of high school, he's not panned out to that whatsoever. And I think that they did not put him in an advantageous spot. And it was a surprising outcome, to say the least, for me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to say stunning because that's probably too strong. I mean, this was a conference matchup, and as you said, Georgia Tech had a pretty good record against them the last few years. But for me, what really stood out was three items here. So first, the offense with DJ. I mean, that was a huge disappointment. They just have not been the same since last year with sorry, what's his name again? Jordan Travis.
Jordan Travis, yep.
Uh, Mike Norvell is 2-8 since Jordan Travis got hurt. And Jordan Travis was a very good player, but I find it hard to believe that he was the sole reason they were such a good offense. But with this game though, I mean, it kind of tells you maybe he was. I mean, Mike Norvell being 2-8 against without him, I mean, that's kind of stunning. I mean, I get last year because he gets hurt, you're scrambling. You had DJ who had a pretty good year last year before transferring in, and then DJ shows up and he can't throw the ball downfield at all. And I don't know if that was by design or DJ's not confident enough or what, but something seemed to miss there. The other point being I had was Georgia Tech just seemed to be coached better. The scheme was great. They had Florida State on their heels the whole game. And I think the other thing was really just how disappointing Florida State was kind of in the trenches. They didn't run the ball well at all. And I thought for sure they would dominate both lines of scrimmage. So, I mean, it is a week 0 game, and with the CFP, of course, you have some leeway, but now Florida State has to figure out fast, and maybe that game was an outlier, but if that's a sign of things to come, I'd be very, very concerned if I was a Florida State fan.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'll just touch on a few points that you made because you made some fantastic points before we quickly move on to this next game here. But I've always thought very highly of Mike Norvell as a head coach, but I fully agree with you. Very disappointing, shocked at that record without Jordan Travis in the lineup. And I thought that the Georgia Tech head coach and Georgia Tech as a whole out-schemed them, out-coached them, out-physicaled them in so many areas and just flat out looked like the better team. And that was a very surprising thing to me. Some positives for Florida State, as you touched on, there's a 12-team playoff now. You could absolutely still go on to win the ACC, and then you would find yourself inside the top 4, one of those teams getting a bye. So the season by no means is over for Florida State, but their backs are now against the wall with very little to no room for error any longer. With that being said, though, that can oftentimes be a catapult and a positive for these teams because when your back's against the wall, it's either you get up, you swing, you fight, and you turn the thing around, or you get knocked down. And so hopefully for Florida State and their fans, it's, the first, and they, show competitive grit, fight, and they go on to make it to the 12-team playoff, and they just get better week by week by week throughout the rest of the year. I mean, think about, I'm not comparing these two teams, but think about the 2014 Ohio State team that went on to win it all. Early in the year, they lost to Virginia Tech, and that Virginia Tech team, they're always scrappy, they're always difficult, but it wasn't any kind of stupendous Virginia Tech team. And then Ohio State just continuously got better and better and better throughout the rest of the year, went on to win the whole thing. So, for Florida State fans, if you want to look at that year and say, okay, we got beat, we got pushed around in week 1, let's just get better week by week. All hope is not lost for Florida State.
Yeah, I mean, it's not over, and luckily the new format, of course, gives them a chance. But yeah, you have to kind of forget about this game and just take care of business week to week and keep getting better, and then who knows what can happen at the end.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll jump into these next few games. These are games we're going to just probably touch on, very briefly here, but we'll start with Montana State at New Mexico. This one ultimately was surprising to me, similar to the Florida State-Georgia Tech game. I did have Montana State winning this game, but the spread was 11 points, at the time that you and I had spoken about this game and kind of given our thoughts on it. And, New Mexico is going through significant transition with Bronco Mendenhall taking over. And I thought New Mexico State came out with the team with their hair on fire. I thought they looked really good. I thought they looked very competitive in this game. And up and until the last about 2.5 minutes of this game, they looked like the better team over Montana State. Dampier, the quarterback for New Mexico, hopefully I'm saying that right, I thought balled out. He went 18 to 26 in this game with 172 yards and a touchdown. I thought that their defense really kept Montana State not only on their heels, but made them uncomfortable for a significant amount of the game. And ultimately, Montana State ended up winning this game, but it was significantly closer than I had anticipated. And I wasn't, I was wavering on whether or not to take Montana State minus 11. Thankfully, I did not. But we got a much closer result in this game than I would have anticipated. So it was a fun game to watch, and it ultimately made for some good TV.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest takeaway from this game and then the two others we're going to touch on real fast here. If you bet the favorites this week, you're in a world of hurt.
Yeah.
Because none of them covered, and they all almost lost outright. So week 0 obviously is it seems like it's a risky week to play your first game because these games were lopsided at points. I mean, New Mexico, they seemed in charge. I mean, Bronco Mendenhall seemed to have his boys going, and all of a sudden, Montana State rips off 21 points in the fourth quarter, and New Mexico can't score. So that game easily could have gone the other way. It took a 21-0 fourth quarter for a a double-digit favorite to win a game. So, that game was pretty crazy. And then, I mean, the parallels are ridiculous because SMU versus Nevada, very similar. I mean, Nevada seemed to be in a good spot, maybe not as up as many points as the other game, but I mean, it took a 16-point fourth quarter from SMU and no points from Nevada to get a 5-point win. I mean,
Yep.
It took Preston Stone throwing a late 34-yard touchdown pass to pull it out. So, I mean, these underdogs brought it, and we'll see if these were just outliers, week 0, anything can happen. But I mean, maybe these teams are better than we thought, and the teams we thought were good aren't. It remains to be seen, but week 0 kind of got us scratching our heads and going back to the drawing board with who we thought was going to kind of win these games and especially cover some spreads. So,
yeah. No, absolutely, and those are great points. And to touch on SMU Nevada from my perspective really quickly here, this was the second most shocking game outside of the Florida State Georgia Tech, which we already touched on. But I thought SMU was going to go in, and I thought that they would handle them significantly and pretty easily. Number one, they had Preston Stone returning at quarterback, who I think is a really good quarterback. Granted, I think fractured his leg last year or broke his leg last year, and so I saw in that game last night he kind of looked a little bit hesitant to run because he's a very good dual threat quarterback. He did take off and have some nice runs, but he seemed to be a little bit more hesitant to do so potentially because of the injury that he sustained last year. But ultimately, SMU went on to win the game, and I thought Preston Stone's connection with wide receiver RJ Maryland was really something special. And just, in looking at, RJ Maryland on the field, that dude looks like a future NFL wide receiver. And I don't know too much about SMU as a football team or program. I'll be, blatantly honest with that. But that guy was handling business in that game last night. He looked to be a viable candidate to be playing on Sundays here in the future. And something that surprised me, and I because this game was so close, I actually went and just kind of looked this up afterwards. These two programs had met 5 times previously, and Nevada actually held a 3-2 series lead in this series between Nevada and SMU, and that was shocking to me, to be honest with you. Similar to Georgia Tech having won more of the last 11, 12 matchups against Florida State than Florida State has won in that series, and so ultimately SMU got the win 29-24 in this game, but I thought SMU was going to win this game fairly easily, and they did not. So that was a bit shocking for me.
Yeah, definitely. And then, of course, I mean, the last game, it wasn't much of a thriller by any means. I mean, once again, ironically, Hawaii scored 14 and Delaware's got 0. Delaware State got 0 in the fourth. But I mean, I don't think there was ever really any doubt or question Hawaii was going to pull out at the end there. I mean, it's Hawaii against Delaware State. So I mean, what?
Yeah,
At least Hawaii has a better team. I think everyone knows that. It was just another game for us to get our college football fix.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I'm going to be honest with you. I didn't watch this game. I was almost a degenerate and stayed up at midnight to about like 2:30, 2:45 in the morning to watch the Delaware State take on the Hawaii Rainbow Warriors, but I did not. And so I kind of had to recap this game this morning and kind of figure out what happened. I thought Hawaii was going to win significantly more convincingly than they did. However, Hawaii beating Delaware State was not a shocker or a surprise, I think, to probably most people. One of the most advantageous things for Hawaii as the home team is that their opponent has to travel to them, which is no easy feat. So I was not surprised to see Hawaii win this game, but I thought it would be more convincing. And when you and I had spoken about this game, I think the line was Hawaii minus 28, and they didn't come anywhere close to covering that line. So as you touched on before we wrap up here, one of the things, we quickly learned this week is that in week 0 games, if you took the favorites or took the spreads for the favorites, you were a very disappointed sports bettor this week because you didn't cover in any of those games. And so I think it's a pretty interesting take that week 0 and early on in the college football season, anything can happen, and just in college football in general. So very excited to have been able to watch some college football here for the first time in a long time since last season ended, and really looking forward to this upcoming week 1. And with that said, before we wrap up here, and I'll let you say a kind of a closeout here if you want to say anything. First and foremost, we really appreciate anybody that tunes in and listens to this first podcast of ours. If you would like, subscribe, comment down below if you agree with us, disagree with us, what you think we got right, what you think we got wrong. It would really help us out. And with that being said, we're going to put out a second video a little later this week, just touching on, maybe 10 games or so previewing for this upcoming weekend, 10 of the bigger games, especially for some of the top opponents, highlighted probably with Georgia and Clemson on a neutral field in week 1 is going to be, I think, a really entertaining and delectable treat for all of us college football fans here. So really excited. Again, anybody that tunes in and listens, really appreciate you guys. And Kriv, before we go out, if you have anything, I'll let you say it.
Yeah, I just want to harp on what you said and just say thank you for taking the time to listen to our podcast here. We look forward to creating a lot more content, and we are going to have some good insights going forward on upcoming games, any breaking news. So be sure to subscribe, and we will keep you guys posted.
I appreciate it, guys. Take care.
Appreciate it.